Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. With just over a week for the budget, we present the second of a series of interviews about the state of the economy and the steps the finance minister would be well advised to take. My guest today is the former deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, let's start with the state of the economy just over a week before the budget is presented. The government points out that GST collections, foreign exchange reserves, and power consumption are at an all-time high, whilst passenger vehicle sales, railway freight, and the PMI index also indicate strong signs of recovery. So does this together suggest that the worst is behind us, or is that a misleading, one-sided, and perhaps even exaggerated conclusion?
Well, I would agree with the view that the worst is behind us because remember, the worst in the first quarter of this financial year was a decline in GDP of 24%. And in the second quarter, the decline was a little over 7%. So there's no doubt that the economy fell off a cliff and is now climbing back up. So there are signs of recovery, no doubt about it. One expected that. That's actually globally, it's also true because everywhere people are slightly revising upward the expectations of growth. But, that doesn't mean that we're in a comfortable position. I mean, while we had a huge decline in the first quarter, and there is a recovery from that position, I think we're still going to end the year with about decline in growth to negative growth of 7.7%, according to the CSO's latest estimates. Now, that means that if it's 15% in the first half decline, and it means in the second half is kind of zero growth over the previous year, to give you something like 7.7% for the year as a whole. I'm willing to go along with that. Yes, the economy is recovering. But there are two things you have to keep in mind. First, it's not an even recovery. I mean, not everybody is benefited to the same extent. In fact, many people have talked about a K-shaped recovery. Some parts of the economy are recovering quite well. But other parts, particularly the small scale, even the medium scale, and certainly the informal sector, they're not well off. And those are problems that we have to look at. It's also really not very clear how things are going to pan out. There is good news, I think, on the COVID scare because it seems that the pace of infections seems to have come down. There's a vaccine that is now started, but there's a lot of uncertainty about how easily we'll be able to get off the COVID scare. And around the world, there's a danger of a second spike. So these are uncertainties which we have to keep in mind looking further ahead.
I want very much to explore 4 or 5 areas of uncertainty with you one by one. But first, let me put this to you. The government is convinced that we are actually seeing a V-shaped recovery. In your answer, you alluded to the possibility of a K-shaped recovery. How strongly do you disagree with the government's claim that the recovery is distinctly V-shaped?
I don't think the government has ever defined exactly what they mean by V-shaped. Let's just limit it for the moment to the production side. I mean, if you have a decline of 15% or so in the first half of the year and a projected zero growth rate compared to the previous year in the second half, then you really cannot call that a V-shaped recovery, but there's a recovery, no question about it. It's not as if having declined, it is sharply going up. I mean, at the moment, there are some indicators which suggest positive growth of the previous year, but there are many others which suggest we haven't got back to the previous year's position. The reason I mentioned K-shaped is that all the data seem to suggest that the formal sector is actually doing a pretty good recovery. I mean, it's V-shaped, if you like, for the formal sector, but is not V-shaped for the whole economy. I mean, the small scale sector, the people employed in informal sector jobs, they are not necessarily experiencing something comparable. And I think if you break down the growth performance, to what does it mean for poorer people, you would come to the conclusion that they still suffer from problems, especially on the employment front. So that would
Let's
be
then
my
at
view.
this
It is a
point,
recovery, but I call it K-shaped.
let's then at this point look at two, three areas of distinct concern one by one. To begin with, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy says that by December 2020, employment had fallen by 14.7 million, and the unemployment rate for December for the month as a whole was 9.1%. Private surveys, however, say, in fact, up to 18 million jobs have been lost. And alongside this, NREGA data suggests that by January the 10th, some 10 crore people had availed of the scheme, which is an increase of 21% over the previous year. So would you begin by accepting that unemployment and joblessness is a key problem that remains and has to be tackled?
I would certainly agree with the view that unemployment is a big problem. You know, unemployment has always been a problem whenever it's existed, and it's always existed. But the difference, I think, this time is that there seems to be an increase. If you go by the CMIE data, there seems to be an increase in the rate of unemployment. I mean, that unemployment rate had shot up in March, in the after March and April, in the aftermath of the lockdown. It then came down again, and it then seems to have edged up. So that is a matter of concern. But you know, underneath the aggregate, there is a decomposition. I think what has happened is there's sort of an increase in rural employment and a fall in urban employment. And many people think this probably reflects the fact that a lot of the migrant labor that kind of went back from urban areas has got absorbed somewhere or the other in agriculture, but it doesn't mean they've been absorbed in high wage employment. That's why the Magnerega demand has shot up. So what you've got is people have been forced back. They're taking what jobs they can, probably at relatively low wage rates. That's why the demand for Magnerega has increased. And I mean, that's an indication that Magnerega as a sort of a social underpinning, social safety net is actually working.
Okay.
In the urban areas, my guess is that even within the formal sector, there's been a lot of shedding of informal contractual jobs. You know, the data show that the growth in profits is much higher than the growth in revenue. That can only mean that firms are basically shedding those elements of cost which they can shed. This is actually quite normal. I mean, look at it this way. If you had a firm that was kind of counting on a 6-7% growth, and suddenly it's clobbered with negative growth, it immediately sheds that part of the labor force which it can shed, which is the informal sector. These are the people who lost jobs and went back home. So I think unemployment is a big problem, and that is where what happens from now onwards is going to be crucial.
Now, a second area of deep concern is the financial sector. The recent financial stability report brought out by the RBI says that non-performing assets are likely to increase to 13.5% by September 2021 compared to just 7.5% a year earlier. And when you look at the NPAs of public sector banks, they could shoot up to 16.2% compared to 9.7% a year earlier. So would you accept we have a fairly serious problem on the financial sector that needs to be tackled?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the Reserve Bank deserves to be congratulated for bringing out, quite frankly, an aspect of the financial we're aware of, but not everybody is aware of. You know, after the asset quality review, which Governor Rangarajan introduced in 2015, the NPAs shot up. Then they slightly started to come down as banks began to sort of make provisions and things like that, and a little bit through normal growth processes and pushing companies to repay debts or pay debts on time. But then the COVID pandemic introduced, correctly in my view, they introduced a temporary moratorium. So things that would have become NPA did not show up and were not recorded as NPA. As that moratorium comes to an end, the ability of firms to service this debt is going to be crucially dependent on growth. I mean, if growth revives big time, then I mean the firms will be able to repay their debt. If growth doesn't revive, then these NPAs will not become standard assets; they'll remain NPAs. And what the Reserve Bank has brought out is that the public sector banks will end up having huge NPAs. I think it's a warning signal which tells you that you've got to do something. That you're sitting on yeah, a major problem. I call this a major constraint on the ability to truly have a V-shaped recovery.
Now, a third area of concern emerges when you look at individual sectors of the economy. As you alluded yourself a moment ago, there's no doubt that big private sector companies have made fairly sizable profits because their wage bill and their input bills have come down substantially. But when you look at MSMEs, which are 30% of GDP and 45% of manufacturing, you notice they're in dire straits. That's also true of construction, which is the second biggest employer. And that's definitely true of sectors that depend upon contact: hospitality, restaurants, hotels, tourism. Would you accept that not only are these sectors that bore the brunt of the lockdown, but now these are sectors that need special attention?
Oh, absolutely. You know, what that attention should be has to be carefully thought out. I mean, clearly, these are the sectors that were worst hit, and maybe if there's a question of judging, you know, how much time do they need to recover, I think it would be reasonable to say that they need more time than the others. But I think you also have to consider whether some of these sectors may simply not in future be profitable at what was earlier thought as feasible levels. I mean, for example, I don't know what's going to happen to restaurants, what's going to happen to shopping malls, what's going to happen to air transport until the fear of COVID infection actually subsides and people start moving around as freely as they used to earlier. There is a very high likelihood that these are sectors that will continue to feel the burden. You know, as far as the MSMEs is concerned, I think many things are happening. There are structural changes taking place in the economy, which are good. There's a process of formalization, which is also good. This is going to make it more difficult for some of the really small enterprises to continue competing with the larger amongst them who are adjusting to the new system. I mean, take, for example, how easily you adjust to digital payments. The larger among the small scale sector or the middle scale sector may adjust very quickly to digital payment system. That will give them a competitive advantage over others. So I think within the MSMEs, there's bound to be a certain amount of sorting out and reshuffling. I think in essence, you need liquidity for those sectors that are inherently viable but need another half a year or 1 year or something. But if a sector has become fundamentally unviable because it has lost competitive advantage to other sectors or other firms within the same sector, you can't solve that problem by giving it liquidity. I mean, that liquidity will just turn into NPAs in due course and will be kicking the can down the road. It's a tough decision and very difficult to know how to decide correctly. But we should assume that there are some sectors which will have these problems, and we should work out what's a viable way of helping them.
There's also a hint there that there could be some sectors or within sectors, some industries, some enterprises that will have to be allowed to close down and go. Some will simply go out of business because throwing good money after them would be a waste. That is inherent in the logic of what you're hinting at.
Well, I didn't think I was hinting at. I was actually saying exactly that because the process of formalization will sort out different enterprises into those that are able to cope with formalization and adjust, and those that aren't. Okay. Now, those that are able to cope will be helping to bring about a structural adjustment which we've generally wanted as part of the modernization of the Indian economy, bringing people into the tax net, etc. Now, those that are not able to cope, I mean, they're simply not going to be able to survive. And it doesn't make sense then to give them more credit. They simply have to exit. Now, exit is always a phenomenon. I mean, no firm has a guarantee of total survival. But my guess is that a transition that might have taken 3 to 4 years is now taking much less time.
Let me at this point put to you a concern raised in an earlier interview by the former chief statistician, Pranab Sen. He looks at the Q2 results that came out not that long ago and saw that both in terms of investment and consumption levels, we are still very substantially below pre-COVID levels. And he's a bit worried that in the next financial year, India could actually see an investment-led crisis. Do you share that concern?
I think investment is going to be the problem area. Let me turn this off. Investment is going to be the problem area because, quite honestly, we've seen over several years a decline in investment. And I don't think that that decline is going to easily reverse itself. That's point number one. It will reverse itself when there is more visible sign of growth in the economy. Because, at the moment, the economy hasn't even got back to the 2019, 2020 level. So the existing capacity can more than cope with the production level of 2019-20. It's when we go beyond that people will start saying, well, we need to invest more because there is demand. Now, in aggregate demand, I mean, consumption, private consumption, it depends upon the growth itself. But there's uncertainty plays a role. I mean, as people get their jobs back, they're not going to be as certain as they were earlier that these jobs are going to continue. So I would say for another year, that uncertainty will remain, and it's quite likely that that uncertainty will lead to them consuming less than they otherwise would have, even with the same job. That's point number one. Point number two is exports is an important part of demand. We hope that the global economy is going to recover. So if we are truly competitive and we can get out there and solve the problems of exporters, we should be counting on and judging our success by whether we've had a strong export rebound. But that's uncertain. We don't quite know how long that will take. And we need clear policies that are pro-exports at the moment. And I don't know whether we're going to get them, but that's what we should be focusing on. Finally, as far as investment is concerned, I mean, investment takes place when you have private investment, either takes place when you have foreign investors with strong balance sheets, and they are getting a reasonable signal that the government welcomes foreign investment in most areas. There are some areas where there are confusing signals. For the domestic investor, you've got two problems. You've got what the government itself identified in 2015 as the twin balance sheet problems. You've got companies that are over indebted, and with the moratorium, etc., the debt burden has actually gone up. So if they're not able to restructure their own balance sheets, they're not going to be in a position to be borrowing in order to invest. That's point number one. And point number two is within the same group, the banking system is really in no position to seek out good borrowers and lend to them. I mean, because of the NPA problem not being addressed, and also hesitation on the part of banks to take risks, especially in the public sector, where, bankers fear that any decisions they take to lend money might be questioned. Now, in the present circumstances, you're always going to be making a judgment that a company that has difficulties today is going to overcome those difficulties, so let's lend to it. Now, if that guess turns out to be false, incorrect, you could be held responsible.
Sure. We've discussed several key areas.
We have a problem which we must address, and that's what banking reform is all about.
We've addressed several areas of key concern that are likely to hold up the speed of the recovery and perhaps affect also the character of the recovery. There's one more that I want to touch on before I ask you what it is in these circumstances the finance minister should announce when she announces the budget on the first. And that last concern is the uncertainty of COVID. I know as we speak, both in terms of cases and deaths, it's remarkably and reassuringly down. We're just a fraction of the levels we were at in September. But as you pointed out yourself, Europe is going through its second spike, America is going through its third, and in both cases, those are much worse than the first. So if India does have a second spike, we all hope it won't, but if it does, we could get pushed back into lockdown, and the recovery we're seeing might not just retard, it could reverse. How much of a concern is that? Or secondly, even if it is a concern, is it one that economically we can't do very much about? We simply have to grit our teeth and carry on.
Well, I think that it clearly is a concern. And if you do get a second spike, it's almost certain that some restrictive measures will have to be introduced. I noticed, for example, that if you look at the hero's welcome, quite rightly accorded to the cricket team, the pictures show huge crowds, and except for the heroes themselves, I mean, nobody's wearing a mask. So, we don't seem to be observing the kind of precautions that are necessary, whether that is because of the excitement, legitimate excitement created by the victory in cricket, or simply the fact that people are forgetting that even with a vaccine, masking is very important. And we have this other danger of a mutant strain of the virus, which some people say in many ways is more worrying. So that's, I think, genuine uncertainty. It's like unknown. I'm not professionally competent. We should ask a virologist or whatever. But I think whoever is planning for the Indian economy must keep in mind that whatever projections we make have to be conditioned on how we are going to react if there's a second spike. I hope, by the way, that the planning for that reaction is taking place in great detail, learning from what happened before.
Let's then, at this point, Mr. Ahluwalia, come to the budget. In just over 7 days' time, the finance minister will rise in the Lok Sabha to present it. What do you believe, against the backdrop of all that we've discussed, are the key steps she must announce?
Well, all our budgets are full of little tweaks of taxes here and there. You identify a sector, you make a little change, you identify a sector with a problem, and you announce a program. These programs are usually rehashes of existing programs. Without knowing what she's announced, one can't comment on that. But I think what she should be doing, and I hope she does that, is to set out the strategy that she should follow. And my view on that is the following. Number one, don't be too fixated on what the growth rate will be next year. Because in all probability, if the recovery continues, we will have a good growth rate. I mean, let's look at the first quarter of the coming year, the year that's about to begin. In the previous year, we had a 24% decline. It's almost certain that unless there's a huge spike in the virus, we will get some kind of a double-digit growth in the first quarter of the next year. But I think it would be a mistake to feel that this is now the recovery. This is now robust growth. This is just part of the process of recovery. So I think she should recognize that, yes, growth next year may well be 8%. I mean, if in the year 21-20, we have to go back to the GDP of 2019-20, and then having dropped by 7.7 this year, we'll go up by 8% or even a little more next year. The real challenge is not what the growth rate next year is going to be, it's what the growth rate in 22-23 is going to be. And I would hope that she structures the budget to lay the foundations for strong growth in 22-23.
What does she need to do? What does she need?
Well, let me just elaborate this a little. When we entered the pandemic, the growth rate in the year before was 4.2%. So we should be very clear that if having recovered, we then deliver 4.2% in 22-23, that would be not acceptable and will not come up to anybody's expectations. Now to your question, what should she do? Well, I think there are 3 or 4 fundamental things that she could address. The first point is that she has to come clean on what the fiscal deficit is going to be. Now, there's a long debate on this, and I don't want to go into this, but the fact of the matter is this year's fiscal deficit will be way off the FRBM limits. We can discuss this in detail if you want, but I would hope that she would make a clean breast of it and simply say that, look, in a year in which GDP dropped by 7.7%, revenues were going to drop, and they did. To maintain the fiscal deficit, I would have had to cut expenditure. This would be the wrong thing to do, and I've not done it. And maybe in the remaining months, she does have time to get more expenditure going. So that's the first thing. That'll jack up this year's fiscal deficit. Now, I'm sure she will be under a lot of pressure to show an improvement next year. And of course, if she could say, well, we're going back to normal next year, that would be wonderful. But, for the reasons we discussed earlier, the uncertainty about the economy, the weakness of demand, my guess is that she cannot withdraw the fiscal stimulus in 1 year. So while she can hope to improve the fiscal deficit, she should get her audience ready to accept that the fiscal deficit next year will also be high. And over time, she's going to make an effort to bring it down. What is needed to bring it down over time? Well, I think 2 things. First, fix the tax system. Now, there are long-term issues, and personally, I think she should set up a committee of experts to really tell us what are the changes in our tax system, including administration, that we need in order to get a really good ratio of tax to GDP. But before any committees are set up, there's one rather obvious thing, and that is the GST. Everybody agrees it was a very good reform. Everybody agrees that the way it has been implemented by the GST Council has greatly reduced its effectiveness. Now, we know what needs to be done.
Can I interrupt at that point? When you say fix the tax, can I interrupt and ask you this? When you say fix the tax system and tackle GST in particular, what is it in detail you want her to do? Can you tell us what levels you want her to reduce taxes to? What she should do with the GST? Can you be specific?
Well, I'm not suggesting that this is a time to reduce taxes. She's already reduced the corporate tax rate, which I think was a good move. I think on income taxes, quite honestly, I don't think that compared to other countries, there's a need for reduction. That's my personal view. In fact, many people would say that the exemption limit in India as a percentage of our per capita income is amongst the highest in the world. So, I mean, we should be very clear. Do you want to exempt people and thus claim some temporary popularity?
What then do you mean by fix the tax system? If reducing taxes is not in mind, what do you have in mind?
Yeah, I think if you look at the tax system, our tax system is very opaque. It's open to multiple interpretations. Different tax officials give different interpretations. Government sort of continuously appeals everything all the way up to the Supreme Court. I think what she needs to do is put in place a group of experts that are familiar with what happens internationally. Okay. And our tax system should be in line with contemporary international practice. Now, let me say there are certain areas where there are debates. I mean, for example, the taxation of digital commerce is a highly debated subject. Different countries take different views. We should be making sure that we are aligning ourselves with a global consensus on this subject.
What about GST? What should she do?
Well, on GST is very clear. We have far too many rates that introduce incredible complexity. That makes it very difficult for small companies to comply. We would be much better off drastically reducing the exemption limits, having a general rate applicable to most items, which would be around 14 or 15%, and a higher rate applicable to some items, which shouldn't be as high as 28%, it could be 24%, but that should not include any intermediates. And I think a shift to a simple system like this, which would imply only the GST Council can do it. And the problem is, whenever it goes there people sort of say, how can I tax this at the same rate as something else? Now, the short answer is that progressivity of taxation is to be done on the direct tax side. Indirect taxes, yes, some progressivity, but
You
otherwise a general rate. That's what happens around the world.
You've explained what you believe she should do in terms of tax, both in terms of making it less opaque, making it less prone to different interpretations, cut down on the appeals, as well as what you think she should do in terms of GST. Beyond that, are there two, three other things you believe the finance minister must announce in the budget? Can you come to those quickly?
Well, in my view, the most important other thing, and I'm not sure whether she would be inclined to do that, is to get away from what we've been doing in the last 3 years, which is a continuous increase in income in import duties. You know, one of the key things of the 1991 reforms was that import duties are not the way of raising revenue, and we should lower our import duties to be in line with those which exist in other East Asian countries. That was done through several governments. The Narasimha Rao government started it, the United Front continued it, the Vajpayee government also continued it, and the UPA also did it, but they didn't bring it all the way down to ASEAN levels. You know, when this government came in, Arvind Panagria was then the vice chairman of the Niti Aayog. In the first report of the new Niti Aayog, he took the line that we should continue to reduce our import duties and move to a more uniform level, and that's the way to make India competitive. I completely agree with that, but unfortunately, that has not been accepted.
You're suggesting the government should accept Arvind Panagria's advice. What you haven't mentioned is there a need, an urgent need for a stimulus?
No, I have. I've said, when you say, let's be clear, what do we mean by a stimulus? There's definitely need for additional expenditure, if nothing else, in the health sector. There's need for additional expenditure compared to norm in those sectors, in those areas which help poorer people, particularly Magnarega. You know, Magnarega is a demand-driven program. So as the economy recovers, the demand for it will go down.
What size of stimulus do you have in mind for the budget?
Well, you know, you can have any increase in expenditure in one area if you're offsetting this by a reduction elsewhere. The best way of measuring stimulus from that point of view is, what about the fiscal deficit? Now, what I'm saying is, I suspect that if you tell the whole story, including off-budget items, the central fiscal deficit may be 7.5%, some people, of GDP this year, that is in 2020-21. What should it be in 2021-22? Ideally, we've talked about 3%, getting down to 3%. They're not going to get down to 3% in 1 year. 7.5 could come down maybe to 6.5. But what she should say is that with the changes she's going to make in the tax system, particularly in GST, and with the reforms that she's going to unleash in the course of the year, the economy will grow faster. And you know, the fiscal deficit also comes down when the growth takes place, because the economy, the GDP is the denominator. And I think she should persuade people. I hope that she will try to say that some of what she's doing will increase growth. Now, what I've said about customs duties, I believe will improve growth, because it will actually improve our export competitiveness. Okay. I think banking reform is crucial. And that's the big thing that's sitting on the table. If you want growth, you better do a lot of banking reform.
Although you're saying she must start to reduce the fiscal deficit from what you believe could be the deficit for the year that's ending of around 7.5% to perhaps 6.5%, but 6.5% is still a very large fiscal deficit for 21-22. How is it to be financed? After all, the economy shrinks, her tax revenues are going to come down. How does she then finance this?
No. Revenues next year, I'm assuming that if the economy shrinks to 7.7%, then next year it will go back to where it was in 2019-20, which means there'll be a growth of about 8%. You add a bit of inflation, nominal growth may well be something of the order of 13% or so. that nominal growth will increase revenues in the current year compared to the current year. But I don't think that all of that should be reflected in an improvement in the fiscal deficit. Maybe there are certain areas on the expenditure side which she'll have to do more than what she's done this year. I mean, for example, the vaccination program. In my view, the government should make a clear commitment that the public sector part of the vaccination program for COVID will be covered by the central government. Now, that would add something to expenditure. And I think that on investment, remember, why do you want a lower fiscal deficit? You don't want the government sucking up all the available savings in the economy, because then private investment can't step in. But my feeling is private investment is not going to be very buoyant next year. So you don't want to have a situation where you've created room, but they're not ready to move in.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, some expenditure, now what expenditure? Increasingly globally, people no longer think of the fiscal deficit as an undifferentiated number. I mean, people would say that if you've increased expenditure by 50,000 crores giving subsidies, that's a stimulus, but that's a bad stimulus. If you've done 50,000 crores of infrastructure investment, that's also a stimulus,
Absolutely. But let's not get lost in those details.
Anticipate.
Let's not get lost in those details. Let me put to you what was said to me last week by a member of the Prime Minister's Economically Advisory Council, Nilesh Shah. He suggested that there are artful and innovative ways in which the government can raise revenue without actually incurring fiscal deficit problems. And he identified 3 or 4. I want to ask you very quickly what you think of them. He talked about a gold amnesty scheme. He talked about a fairly extensive strategic investment program for PSUs. He talked about legalizing gambling and betting. And most importantly, he says the government sits on multiple assets which can be monetized, ranging from enemy property, which it's been sitting on for 70 years, through to defense and railway land. What do you make of these ideas quickly?
Well, these are all forms of non-tax revenues, and I think as a general rule, we should explore them. I'm not a great supporter of these amnesty schemes, but every 5 years, governments do introduce them. Historically, they've never really led to very much. I don't have a strong view on that, and I don't think it'll produce much. On the issue of sale of public sector assets, absolutely right. We should be having a much more aggressive public disinvestment program. But frankly, that was there in the budget this year. We didn't get anywhere. I don't know whether and we didn't get anywhere in a period when the stock market is booming. So I think what you need is genuine privatization, not just selling shares of companies that are going to continue to be managed as public sector companies, but actually sell out with strategic investors.
Okay.
If the government could do that, that would be very good. And as far as land is concerned, yes, I think there is a huge amount of land which seems to be just locked up somewhere. We looked at these things in the past, and the legal restrictions in doing that are really quite large, because very often it's not really clear who has the legal right to do it, what's the role of state governments, etc., etc. But certainly, I think that would be a good thing, and we should do that.
Now,
the important thing is the privatization.
The government is extremely keen to attract to India investment that they believe is looking to relocate from China. So far, it's tended to go to Vietnam and Bangladesh. The government hopes that the reduction announced in corporate rates, perhaps the new labor laws that have just been formulated, perhaps the agricultural laws, although they are pretty controversial, will attract that investment. Do you think that's likely, or do you think we need to do a lot more to make sure that foreign investors who are leaving China come to India?
I think we do have to do a lot more, but let me say that, I don't think it's so much the corporate tax rate. That I think is, as a rate, not so unreasonable. The biggest problem there, quite frankly, is the reversal in the strategy of lowering import duties, which internationally is being read as wanting to de-link from the global economy. And I think the recent decision not to join up the RCEP agreement has sent a very negative signal. I mean, originally it was the Prime Minister who launched the slogan of Act East, and the government carried on the negotiations, and there was a very strong expectation that we would join. Now, remember, this is the part of the world economy that's going to grow the fastest. This is the part of the world economy that's most integrated with the world. This is the part of the world economy which is not resorting to protectionism. So global supply chains located in Asia would look to diversify away from China because China has become too big, too strong. There are a lot of suspicion. But how does India attract these investments if our domestic policy is to raise import duties, which make people feel that, we would be subject to pressure from any number of people to raise import duties. And we've also decided not to join RCEP. Most of these global supply chains revolve around one or the other country or more countries in Asia.
Okay.
So frankly, getting into RCEP was, to my mind, one of the best things we could do in order to make it clear to everybody that we want to get into global supply chains. Now, we still have that option. I mean, I don't know, it's not a budget issue, but it's something that if we were to do, would actually be much more effective than many other things.
Absolutely. You're making it very clear that if the government is serious about attracting investment from abroad, and particularly investment that's considering relocating from China, we must change our attitude to import duties and we must change our attitude to RCEP. Otherwise, while saying we want to attract investors, we're actually giving them the wrong signals. I've got two last questions left. I want to put them.
But can I just intervene? The one issue where I talked about that aligning your global tax administration practices, your tax administration practices with global practices is very important.
Okay.
I mean, one of the biggest complaints we have is arbitrariness, and we seem to be doing things that no other country does. I mean, it's not foreigners, even Indians say that.
It's on arbitrariness that I want to ask you one of those two last questions. The government has just lost two big arbitration cases to do with retrospective taxation. The Vodafone case, which sadly goes back to your time when you were in office, and the Cairn case. And practically every economist, all the pink papers had advised the government not to appeal, but it's decided to appeal both. Has it made a mistake? And in doing so, is it once again sending the wrong signals to investors and putting them off?
I think that is an unfortunate decision, quite honestly. And, I don't know how much of this to blame the government for and how much the system. Because the truth of the matter is that somebody has to make a proposal. Should we accept this arbitration award or not? And when that person makes that proposal, I don't know, for example, whether from the technocratic side, the government received the advice that we should not, and then consciously chose to do the other thing. Very often, the person making the recommendation is mindful that if he recommends not following this, he will be accused of having lost the exchequer a certain amount of money. On the other hand, recommending doing it might lose the economy multiple times of that in investment, but nobody is ever going to be blamed for that. So okay. I do think that this was unfortunate, and there it is. And for myself, I was against the Vodafone decision, and I made that my views known at the time, as I've mentioned in my book Backstage, that I was not in favor.
Absolutely, and you advised the then Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee. You also advised the Prime Minister, and unfortunately, neither gentleman heard you. Not only is that part of your book, but you revealed further details in the interview you gave me in March 2020. If people want to know more about the position you took and the politics behind it at the time, I recommend that they watch that interview of March 2020 given to The Wire. But now my last question. There's a lot of concern, both internationally, but also, let's be honest, at home, at what's called the divisiveness of Indian society. I refer to the National Register of Citizens, the Citizenship Amendment Act, love jihad, beef lynching, whatever has happened in Kashmir. and the general attitude to Muslims. And many believe that this is also putting off investment, both international investors and even domestic investors. Do you share that concern? And do you believe that this is another restraint or holdback on the economy that must be tackled? A quick answer.
Well, divisiveness is a fundamental problem in any society. And I think we should be tackling that independent of what it does to the economy. So I would not like to say that this must be tackled if we want to have growth. I think we need to tackle it to have a decent society. Yes, I think there is a perception that we are a polarized society, and many societies are polarized. I mean, until a short while ago, everybody was talking about the United States being a highly polarized society. People are not actually surprised that there are tensions. I think what people look for is that when these tensions surface, how does the government react? How does the society react? Does it sort of try to address these problems in a manner that brings everybody together and brings them on board? So I do agree that, particularly for a democracy where you cannot eliminate dissent, it becomes doubly important that people should be able to say that India is a society that is handling its problems of divisiveness and polarization rather well. We've always had these problems. The question is, how do we handle them? And I think we need to do more to give the signal. Not that we are not divided or that there aren't division points. There always are. There have been. But we are handling them well. And I think that's what we should be concentrating on.
Montek Singh Ahluwalia, that's a very clear answer. We need to show the world that we have the capacity to handle our problems well. At the moment, sometimes we suggest to the world that we exacerbate them instead. I thank you for this interview and for the comprehensive sweep with which you've not just viewed the present state of the Indian economy, but also addressed the steps and measures the government should consider taking when the finance minister announces the budget in 8 days' time. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you, Karan. Pleasure to be with you.